service only for the safety of everyone. But luckily, we've been doing curbside service since the summer. So we are well practiced with this. It's a well oiled machine. So patrons can find the books they want on our library catalog, place them on hold. They get a notification that the books are ready, and they come down during our business hours, and we bring their books out to their trunk. And it's really great, really contactless and safe for everyone. We are also doing a lot of virtual events like this one. So excited to be here. We have another author event on this Saturday with Mary Rose Wood. So everyone who wants to keep up with our events, because we do book clubs and virtual story times as well, everything has gone virtual. Anyone who wants to keep up with that should follow us on Facebook. And also, of course, just check out our website, because any and all updates will be posted on our Facebook and our website. And of course, we are picking up our phones during business hours, and our phone number is on the website. So anyone who needs help finding a book, or just anything, needs to look up some information, librarians are here for you. Oh, and I wanted to mention our curbside concierge service, where if you want a book, but you don't know what you want to read, and you trust your librarians, because everyone trusts librarians, right? We love picking out books for people. So you can fill out a short survey on our website telling us what you like, and we'll pick out 5 books for you. So it'll be a bit of a surprise, and you come get your books through our curbside service, and that's our curbside concierge. So that is about what's happening at the Mission Viejo Library. Thank you so much, Julie.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Allison. And we will see you on Saturday. Take care. Bye.
See you then.
Okay. So I don't know where the chat function went tonight, so I don't see it.
I don't see it either.
Yeah. So I'm going to put in the Q&A is where I will see if I can figure out how to put the books in that, or if I can figure out how to turn the chat on, I will do that. But I wanted to let people know that if you do have a question for Melanie or Elizabeth, that if you scroll across the bar there at the bottom, you'll see the Q&A, and that's where you can put your questions in. And so I'm not going to bring those in live. I'll bring those in. Melanie and Elizabeth are going to chat for about 35-ish minutes, and I'll bring those questions into them after they're done chatting. So let's get on with the show. So Melanie Benjamin is the New York Times bestselling author of Mistress of the Ritz, The Girls in the Picture, The Swans of Fifth Avenue, The Aviator's Wife, The Autobiography of Mrs. Tom Thumb, and my personal favorite, always and still, Alice I Have Been. Her newest novel, The Children's Blizzard, is a January indie next pick. We'll both hold that up. Melanie is a native of the Midwest, having grown up in Indianapolis, Indiana, and now lives in Williamsburg, Virginia. And Elizabeth Lutz is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of both historical fiction and nonfiction. Her books include The $80 Champion, was an indie next pick, The Perfect Horse, and my favorite, Finding Dorothy. Love that book. You see a theme here with these, like, you kind of get what my style is. All have received numerous accolades. Elizabeth majored in history at Yale, and in both her fiction and nonfiction, she is known for her deep and detailed research. She lives in Southern California and Northern Michigan. With that, ladies, have a wonderful conversation. I'll see if I can get that chat working, and we'll see you in a little bit.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you so much. Hey, Elizabeth.
Hi, Melanie. So,
my friend. Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I see I'm in California and you're in Virginia, and it looks like
this is like a
behind you, and it's still sunny here.
I know. Elizabeth, so I've done all these wonderful events for the Children's Blizzard with so many wonderful bookstores and libraries and fabulous, generous authors. But Elizabeth is my real friend. Like, in real life, we've met and talked. And she's one of those. I go to you a lot for advice and probably, career, the making of the sausage stuff, right? The career stuff, the publishing stuff, all that fun stuff that we don't talk about, like in real, to readers and things. That you've been such a friend for me, and true blue, and and I have come to you a lot in the last couple of years, and I just appreciate that so much. So tonight is special for me. Because we haven't been able to see each other in person. I usually get down to over to Orange County, usually in the fall for a vacation. And then Elizabeth always generously drives down to meet me, and we say we're going to have, I don't know, coffee, and we end up spending the entire day talking.
The entire day. Yes, coffee turns into lunch, and then we have another coffee. And so and it is really fun and interesting to do something like this with somebody that I know so well. And I should say, Melanie and I have known each other since long before either one of us was ever published, or at least a good while before. So this is a journey that we've been through together with all its ups and downs. And that's something that I think gives us a real perspective. And I just want to share my little story. I was so excited when Melanie decided to write this story, but I'm going to tell about when she and I we often engage together on Facebook. And one day, do you remember this, Melanie? She put a tiny little snapshot of one page of this novel when it was not finished, I believe.
Oh, no. And I had not shared what I was writing. Nobody knew what I was writing yet.
It was a deep secret. And there was, I could only read less than a paragraph, I think.
Right, yeah.
And somehow, as I read it, I got chills, which I'm getting those same chills now. And I was like, I think I know what she's writing about. And I sent her a message and I said, are you writing about the children's blizzard? And I remember you were like, what? What on earth? But that's because I think that you were really born to write this story. And it's such a great story that I wanted somebody to tell. But interestingly, I'd never thought that it was a story that I wanted to tell. I wanted to read about it. And so when I realized that you had chosen this story to write about, as a reader, I was feeling very excited and kind of greedy. Like, when do I get this book? I can't wait. And I can also say that you just realized it so beautifully, that it was not the story that I thought it was, I guess, when I launched into it. And yet it illumined the event for me in such an incredible way. Wow. So I just, I kind of want to just start from this. We've got the whole, where do you get your ideas question. But I thought I kind of knew what Melanie Benjamin did, because you've told these illuminating stories, the story behind the story of women who otherwise we might not know such about. And in this story, you did something different. You took an event, a moment in time, and then you built your story around it. So what brought you to that?
Yeah, and I do remember that moment, and I do remember actually the section that I shared on Facebook, because I didn't want to give anything away. And you were like the only person I know who knew about this. When I said, well, I'm writing, I said, well, I'll tell you. And I said, it's about the children's blizzard. And anyone else that I would say that to, not many, had never heard of it. You were the only person who had heard of this. So how did you know about it?
In truth,
it happened.
Okay. In truth, perhaps fascinated for the same reason that I believe you might have been fascinated, Laura Ingalls Wilder.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's a good,
And because I had written a book that was set in the same time period in the Dakotas, I had come across references to it once or twice. So, but I hadn't seen the drama in it. And I that's one of the things I find so fascinating about the writing process, where two people will look at the same thing. And for one person, a story starts to unspool. And for another person, it doesn't, so that's what I was curious about.
Yeah, because, recently, so years ago, okay, this is off the subject, but Marie Benedict just had this book about Agatha Christie, her whole mystery of disappearing. Like right after Alice I Have Been, I thought that would be a book I should write. So we're talking 10 years ago, I thought, oh, that's an interesting thing to write, but I just couldn't see myself doing it. I don't know, sometimes I just couldn't see it. And then recently I was talking to Kate Quinn, and I had thought of maybe doing something about the night witches, which she so brilliantly did in The Huntress just now. But I never went there. I thought about it, but I just didn't see myself writing that book. So
what you're saying, see yourself writing, isn't that really kind of the key?
Right. So, so for this one, yes, you're right, in that it was a departure, in that it's not writing about a real person who has lived. And, again, these are conversations you and I have had. You're always trying to stay ahead of the game a little bit. You want to write what you want to write. You want to write what your readers will want. but you can see some certain trends in publishing that maybe you want to avoid, or maybe a crowdedness in a certain genre, which was kind of what I was feeling. And I also wanted a challenge for myself. And at that moment, I didn't feel challenged thinking about writing about another real person's life. I wasn't excited about that thought anymore. And I'm not saying I won't ever go back there. I'm just saying at that moment, after I had turned in Mistress of the Ritz and was thinking about the next book, I just wasn't excited to continue down that particular path. So that's when I started thinking, but I always want to write about historical fiction because I'm a history junkie, right? And so that's how I had heard about the Children's Blizzard, just reading other books about histories and the plains. So I had also wanted to kind of write a grittier book, a bigger book with a bigger story, perhaps than just a life or the story of a life. I wanted many lives and many stories to tell. And I thought it had to be against the backdrop of something really big and dramatic and important that most people had never heard about. So it was all those things. And I am from the Midwest. My mother's family were Germans who came here around the same time as many of the immigrants who would end up being impacted by the Children's Blizzard in 1888 did. Although my mother's family settled in Illinois, not Nebraska or Dakota. Laura Ingalls Wilder certainly played a part. I loved those books when I was little. I loved prairie books, pioneer books. I loved pretending to be a pioneer girl. There was a living history museum where I grew up in Indianapolis called Connor Prairie Farm. That was a restored farm and kind of working farm from the 1820s. And I remember going there as a child on field trips and I'm like the girl, the weirdo kid who was wanting to actually be these people. Like I wanted to wear the clothes and I wanted to churn the butter. And so that was all kind of in me. And so I thought about this particular story based on the real 1888 blizzard, known to history as the Children's Blizzard, because so many of its victims were sadly children. And it's this blizzard that came after an exceptionally warm morning, after a long period of bitter cold. And on that particular morning, children went to school and people went out to run errands to town or to exercise the animals, not wearing what they normally would on a winter's day. And then this blizzard came in right around the time when school was letting out. And it is called the Children's Blizzard because of that, because so many of the victims were school children, but also not just the children, but the teachers in these prairie schoolhouses who were just young girls, if you know your Laura Ingalls Wilder, of 16 or 17, many of them boarding out away from home for the first time, who had to make life or death decisions in an instant. Should they send the children home and hope they would outrace the storm? Or should they keep them inside these really poorly insulated buildings, basically just shelters? They were never intended to shelter anyone overnight, and risk freezing to death or starving to death because no one would, they didn't know how long the storm would last. So that is the kernel of the book. And as I researched it, I discovered it was a story of immigrants. It's an immigrant story because so many of those homesteading the Great Plains in these years were immigrants from Norway, from Sweden, from Germany, Northern European immigrants who were brought here, another thing I found out, through a disinformation campaign, a massive propaganda disinformation campaign. The railroad boosters and the state boosters and territory boosters of this area needed white people to settle the land that had been tragically taken away from the Native Americans. And the railroads needed to make money and the territories needed to become states. So they needed people out there. They needed goods to ship and they needed bodies to ship. So they actually paid people to write disinformation stories masked as news that they placed in newspapers in Northern Europe and also in some of the cities of the East. So that intrigued me and seemed very similar to today. And the notion, even though I wrote this a year ago, but it's very relevant today, of teachers, school teachers, risking their lives in the classroom, So all these things and also the tragedy, obviously, of the Native Americans hangs over this book. And the fact that it wasn't just white people settling the plains, because I have a Black character in my novel as well. But the heart of the story are two sisters who are both school teachers, who both in separate districts, who make very different decisions in that heartbreaking, terrifying moment, and how the impact of those decisions changed the trajectory of their lives and the lives of their pupils forever. So that, in a nutshell, is what the Children's Blizzard became and why I was interested in writing it in the first place.
Yeah, I was interested by something when I read this book from a writer's perspective. Obviously, at the heart of the story, you have this difficult situation where these young girls have to make this life or death decisions, and you highlight that so beautifully. But from a structural perspective, what I thought was really interesting was you plunge us into the icy heart of that blizzard very, very fast. This is a if you haven't read it yet out there, be prepared, clear your plates for a little while, because this book brings you right in. And I thought that was really interesting, but I wondered, when you were writing it, did you give any thought to whether you wanted to start with the blizzard or build up to the blizzard?
There was a moment early on when I was talking with my editor at the time, and she had suggested maybe bookending it with a more contemporary timeline. So I originally wrote it that way, where the first chapter would have been a contemporary kind of blizzard situation, and bookended that way. But then I really felt strongly that wasn't the right thing for me or for the book. So once I kind of got rid of that, no, I immediately, I really did intend us to plunge right into the blizzard. Somebody described the book as Stephen King meets Little House on the Prairie, and I really do think it is, because particularly that first half of the book, we are in this blizzard. It is this menacing thing that is a big character in the novel, and we have all these different people's lives. You know, they're all caught up in their own drama and their own, you know, need to survive in the midst of this storm. Yeah, I did want to just start it right away and plunge the reader right into it right away, because I never intended for the blizzard to last the whole book. I felt that if we were stuck in a blizzard for, I don't know how many pages is a book, like 360 pages or whatever, that might be a little too much to take. It might be a little claustrophobic for the reader. It just might be just a little too much. So I intended it to be almost in two sections, where the storm, again, right away from the very beginning, the storm strikes, upending everything and putting everybody's lives at stake. And then the aftermath, because I wanted to explore the impact of these decisions on a lifetime, even those who technically survive the storm. And you know, look, not everyone's going to survive the storm. This is kind of like a disaster movie of a book, and not everybody makes it, but some do. And there are a lot of stories of inspiration and survival and hope, as well as tragedy. But I just wanted to explore the impact of those decisions, particularly those two decisions of those two school sisters, and show that even those maybe who survived the storm maybe didn't really survive it. Maybe they became victims of it. Maybe it took a lifetime for them to finally kind of succumb to their wounds or to the tragedy of this. But how those decisions impact the life and what happens next. And I also found it was really interesting. And I definitely go into this in the novel. One of the main characters is a failed newspaper man named Gavin Woodson, who in my novel is completely fabricated, but he represents those who wrote those stories, fake stories, to lure these immigrants who he doesn't really think very much of in the beginning out to the prairie, and how his journey becomes this kind of journey of redemption as he writes about the aftermath of the storm. And that really did happen, that there was this whole raising up of some of the school teachers to a heroine status. Almost they became media darlings of the day. And I felt that was really interesting to explore how these just ordinary 16-year-old school teachers who just got up that day and went to teach, suddenly, after surviving this harrowing storm, found themselves getting, proposals from strangers and songs written about them. Again, to contrast that with the journey of the sister who doesn't find herself treated that way in the aftermath. So I had always intended the second half of the book to truly be what happens next. Because I'm always fascinated about that, like the movie Titanic, which I love, and I always wanted a movie about what happened to Rose afterwards when she got to America and, she was free from her mother and from, society and missing Jack, but going on to live this wonderful life. I thought that would be a really great book or a movie. So that's why I wanted to take the whole second half of the book and kind of put it in that direction.
Yeah, well, I thought it was really great. And I think that's challenging from a craft perspective, because when you put people immediately into that very catastrophic situation, you also have to make us care about them very quickly. And you, boy, we're invested fast. And and I thought that was really great. But I want to talk a little more. You mentioned the blizzard being a character, and so I want to know, what's that like? How, first of all, how did you recreate the blizzard from a historical perspective? And also, why do you think, was the weather so important? Was it just this event? Where did a catastrophic event fit like that kind of in the whole experience of being an immigrant for people?
Well, if you've ever read the Little House on the Prairie books, you've read the book, The Long Winter, that is based on an actual winter in the same time period, which is the end of the time period known as the Little Ice Age. And this is what was so heartbreaking about those fake news stories, because they misrepresented, I guess you could say, in the mildest term, the weather of the Great Plains. And when they called it mild and gentle, and the winters were nice and everything was warm and anything would grow, when in fact, the weather in the Great Plains in this time period, we're talking like late 1870s into the late 1880s, was devastating. Winter, spring, summer, fall. You had the grasshoppers in the summers, and you had the prairie fires, and you had the spring floods, and then you had these horrible winters, starting in that year of 1881 that Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote about, which was just one continuous blizzard after blizzard after blizzard. There was also a devastating blizzard the year before the children's blizzard. It was called the Great Die-Off that winter, because so many cattle died. It was like the tail end. So many ranchers thought that like Nebraska and the Dakota Territory would be a great place to ranch cattle. And a lot of investors, even from the East, came west, including a young man named Theodore Roosevelt, came east in that time period after the death of his first wife, and he raised cattle in the Dakota Territory. And then in 1887, and the winters were so bad, they would always lose huge amounts of cattle over the winter. But the year of 1887 was absolutely the worst, as far as that so many cattle died that it was called the Great Die-Off. And after that winter, Teddy Roosevelt, washed his hands of ranching and went back east and got into politics. So then in 1888, you get the children's blizzard. So the weather was just devastatingly and punishing in that time period. And I absolutely needed to, when we talk about the homesteaders, and certainly you always have to deal with the tragic history of the Native Americans who were here first. And I do, obviously, this is part of my book as well. But you can't deny the fortitude of those who did leave a different climate to come over here to try to make it. And in fact, though, in those years, more of them went back home than stayed, because the weather was so horrible, and they really couldn't grow anything there in that time period. So that's all. Yeah, the weather had to be a character. It had to be a part of it, and it is in the Little House on the Prairie books too.
It is. Yeah.
Well. Yeah. There are fires. There's the long winter. They definitely, the nature and the Great Plains. I very much wanted this book to really highlight how vast it was, how nature will always win, and how the people's stories, no matter how compelling, they were just tiny little insects compared to every, this enormous, vast canvas of nature and weather.
Yeah, I think that came through really, really clearly. And, as a fellow Laura Ingalls Wilder aficionado, certainly so many of my ideas about what that part of the world was like, that time period was like, were formed there. And what I found that was so interesting with your treatment in the children's blizzard, though, is the way that you did widen that world to bring in people that don't occur in in Laura Ingalls Wilder's description. And just kind of as a corollary, obviously Laura Ingalls Wilder's reputation has taken quite a hit recently. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Why did you decide to broaden your lens to include a wider cast of characters and in this book than what you would have seen, let's say, in a Laura Ingalls Wilder book?
Right. Well, I think you're right. I have, this is a hard thing to say, particularly for women of our age. Those books were just, everything to us. First reading the books, and then the Little House on the Prairie TV series that everybody had prairie dresses back then. Remember the Laura Ashley prairie dresses that everybody
Oh yes, no, I mean yes.
Gunny Sacks too. They had so it was it's hard to say anything negative about these books because some people are so fiercely protective about them. Mm-hmm. However, if you've I read the biography of her called Prairie Fires. And I have not yet seen the American Experience American Masters documentary that just came out about her yet. But the truth is that if you are not a little white girl reading those books, there's a lot that's very hurtful and devastating in them to everybody else. They were written in the 30s. They were written for children. They were written by a white woman, and they are about a white American-born family. Which is very interesting because even when in those books, when they do mention or encounter immigrants, Norwegians often, it's not always in the most flattering light, the way she depicts them. And there's a big problem with the depiction of Native Americans and in Black people on the plains. I mean, they don't even exist hardly at all. I think there's that doctor in Little House on the Prairie when they all have fever. They had the ague, the fever and ague, and he comes and it's a Black man, and it's so startling to them. So it's a very narrow, non-inclusive portrayal, whitewashed version of Manifest Destiny in the Ingalls family. And it's certainly, there are a lot of nice things about it. Family values and hard work and all that. That's great, but it's not the truth. And so what I wanted to do was write an adult version, a grown-up version, a realistic version of what the prairie was. And in order to do so, you do have to question a lot of the things that she wrote, and you have to kind of push back, and you have to maybe correct the interpretation or the representation. So that is why I do have a Black bartender who lives in Omaha who finds that when the storm hits Omaha, he finds that his community is absolutely left to himself. And I also definitely wanted to highlight the different ways that what immigrants were taught versus the way the Black children were taught in Omaha versus the way the Native American children were taught in the horrible, forced kind of assimilation kind, where they were basically kidnapped from their parents and forced to learn English ways, I guess you could call it. So that's why he's in there. That's why I definitely do talk about the Native Americans. And that's why I tell a little darker story. The characters, some of the stories in this novel have a darker reality. And that is also the truth. Not everyone was a serene, loving Caroline Ingalls who put up with her husband dragging her, ever westward. Some women it was a hard life. And some women actually did have a really hard time emotionally and mentally. The prairie did a number on them emotionally and mentally. And there's a character in the novel who absolutely represents that. So I just wanted to write a grown-up version of not trying to correct anything because that's not my job. Those books definitely have their place and certainly in my memory and my heart, but I also just wanted to say, but this is a little bit maybe more realistic here.
Mm-hmm. I think that's what I really love that, because I think that many of us, we were very, very deeply shaped by many of the books that we read as children. And that series in particular meant a lot to many people. But then there's this like satisfying feeling when you're like, oh, wait a minute. And you kind of peel that lid back and the author, Melanie, kind of let us see the past again. And it's familiar and yet unfamiliar and new. We think that we know this place and we think that we have some kind of particular attachment to it. But then, all of a sudden you're showing us like, oh, okay. And that was, I found that very satisfying in this book.
Yeah, that's a good, I've never thought of it that way, but yeah, because you come to this, you know, with a familiarity with those novels and an interest in this time period, right? And it
Yeah.
certainly is hugely part of the American story, right? The Homestead Act itself and the settling of the Great Plains, but just, you know, we know now in 2021 that for too long it was only told from one perspective. And now we have to start, and we have and continue the effort to be more truthful and include everyone's stories, not just one particular, one particular camera lens of this. So yeah, yeah. So yeah, nothing else to say. That was really, really profound, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
I'm speechless.
Well, so let's talk about, now I want to talk about, I guess, I mean, I don't know if you had a favorite character. I really feel like maybe my favorite character was Gavin. But I really wanted you to talk more. You brought it up a little bit earlier about this idea of being a propagandist and selling this vision of a place that really didn't exist. And I found that so fascinating. You know, we think that we have these problems happening in our time that have never happened before. So do you mind talk a little bit about him?
So I always knew that the two sisters would be the protagonists, and then Annette, there had to be a child in the children's blizzard, right? Who this girl whose mother basically sells her into servitude in the household in which one of the school teachers boards out. So they were always going to be, you know, the center of the book. But I really, really was so fascinated with this whole aspect of the fake news stories. So another major character is this character named Gavin Woodson, who the first three characters I just mentioned are somewhat based on some of the actual survivors and victims of the storm, because there is a wonderful collection of oral histories of those who survived the storm or witnessed it. Gavin was completely fabricated. He's a dissipated newsman, failed journalist, I guess you could say, who had a run-in with Joseph Pulitzer back east, and finds himself in godforsaken Omaha, writing these, what he calls pabulum, at the behest of the boosters in town. And he loathes himself for it. And he loathes the people who he feels the rubes who swallowed his lies. And he doesn't have a lot of respect for them or for him. And he doesn't really care much what happened to them once they got there. And that was true. They just needed their bodies. They didn't always care what happened to them once they got there. So his arc in the novel I found the most satisfying, I think, and the whole entire second book really becomes Gavin's journey, his search for this kind of mythological ideal maiden of the prairie in his mind, who he kind of has a chance encounter with just a nameless young woman right before the storm. And his kind of obsession with this propels him to go out into the storm in the aftermath of the storm and find the stories to tell, and to finally make these people real, that they become, they start out as just kind of nameless, faceless victims of his prose. And through his journey, he sees them finally. He sees them as real people and their struggles and their problems and their goodness and their bravery. And he redeems himself in the aftermath of the novel. And like I said, he really took over the whole second half of the book in a way I hadn't really anticipated. But I do love his story too. I love his journey. It surprised me a bit when I was writing it.
Well, it's interesting because, you obviously we're in the middle of a terrible tragedy right now. And it is, there's this dignity in giving people, names and faces and stories.
That's a good point.
Really makes them more, individuals, and you feel their loss. And I felt that very much reading this book. And I'm sure from a craft perspective, you had a large cast of characters, and you had a blizzard as the character, and there was a lot going on, but there was that very specificity of the way that you portrayed each one of these characters as real people in real circumstances, whether they were bad or good. And there was something about his ability to begin to understand the power of storytelling itself, that he was telling a story that could actually have an impact for good or bad.
Well, I think there might have been in the back of my, so I finished the book over a year, just about a year ago. So obviously it was pre-pandemic, but it was certainly in the midst of the last 4 years during which journalism has been under attack. And journalists have been afraid of, literally risking their lives to tell these stories. And now we're in the middle of a pandemic. Obviously could not have predicted that, where certain outlets like the New York Times, they make a point of every day naming names of those and telling the stories of those who have passed away in the pandemic, so that they're not just numbers. And so I think there probably was in my mind that I wanted to make this a love letter to teachers for sure, because it definitely is in these two school teachers, but also, I wanted to remind us all that the power of journalism, when it does tell the truth, and when it does tell the whole story, and when it does, go out and beyond, and it looks for the people who are impacted, by policy, that's heroic, and it's vital, and it's necessary, and we needed it then, and we need it today. Yeah,
I think that came through.
yeah.
That came through for me. Yeah. And also I think, kind of going back to what we were saying about, maybe peeling the lid back on this to show us the real truth of the history. It's like, this is a really important part of our American history. Most of us have pretty strong feelings about the pioneers and that period in our history. But you have the courage to believe that if you show people the true story and the real depth of it, that this will enhance our admiration for them, not diminish it in any way. That came through very powerful to me as I was reading it. It was like, it's okay. Their lives were harder than we even thought, but that's okay.
Yeah.
And as you said, there's some problems around the settling of the plains because of the fact that we were seizing land that was already belonged to somebody else. And obviously that's problematic. And yet it doesn't, looking away from it doesn't make us understand it better, but going in and telling those individual stories truly as they are, it illuminates in to me, a very profound way.
I mean, you can still admire the people who would leave their home and sail across an ocean and take a train and not speak the language and try to start over for a better life for themselves and for their children. You can admire that, and I hope you do in this. You can also see some of the tragedy in that, in doing so, they ask too much of their sons and daughters, tying them forever to this land. I mean, I think it's really important to understand that the children of the children's blizzard were the grandparents in the Dust Bowl. And that's a tragic story as well. And generations and generations of people tied to the land, to the farm, without a chance to get out because of the choices their parents made. So I want that aspect as well to come out in this book. And then also, obviously, again, the terrible tragedy. So we can admire these people who did this while deploring the fact that it came at such a cost. Genocide, forced, incarceration of the people whose land it had been. I mean, it's all a tragedy. And if you can tell the whole story, you're not diminishing the courage. You're not diminishing the fortitude that we have for so long focused on and admired. But you still have to tell the whole story. I mean, I just think
and it makes you. I just think
as an author today, we have to do that. We can't not do that.
And it makes the reader feel, I think, just illuminated because you think the story. I find that for me, the most satisfying historical fiction is when a writer takes me to a place that I thought I knew. And then I get there and I look around, I'm like, oh, this is like more real in a certain way than I thought it would be. And I think your book really accomplished that.
Thank you. I just couldn't see myself telling the story in any other way. That is just not who I am, and that's not what I could do. I put my whole heart in this novel, and I think I talk about how it was a cathartic writing experience for me, because I truly, I painted with all the colors in the paint box, right? There's every emotion that's in this, and I hope that that's for the reader too, that it's not just the tragedy, but of course there is tragedy, but it's also all the other emotions, you know, that you see people, hope and resilience and forgiveness and understanding, and some people's lives change for the better, surprisingly, because of this. So that was also very appealing to me, but you know, that also means that I had to tell the whole story. I just could not, I would never have approached this any other way.
So you're from Indiana. You're a Midwesterner, and this is a you know, a Midwestern or a Great Plains story. And I would have loved to have written this book, but I actually grew up in LA, so all I knew about snow was what I read in The Long Winter. So tell me, how do you think you know, your own perspective made you the right person to write this story? Because I feel that you were.
Well, you did write Finding Dorothy, which is set, as you said, quite a lot of it in Nebraska and South Dakota. I mean,
well,
or Kansas. I mean, not Kansas, but you did a very good job with that. Well, yeah, and part of that is like, it's so funny. It tickles me. I remember when the autobiography of Mrs. Tom Thumb came out, and it is about a woman who was 32 inches tall, and people would honestly ask me if I walked around on my knees to get to write from her perspective. And it's like, no, it's called imagination. The ability to imagine myself 32 inches tall, not that I walked around on my knees. So no, I didn't literally go out into a blizzard to write this, although I had some encounters with snow.
Have you been in a blizzard though, Melanie?
Well, not that I really remember, only from the safety of my home. Towards the end of the writing of this, I went up to Colorado, which I always do. Estes Park usually is where I usually finish up a book. I write a lot up there, and I always go like in October, and I went October, early November. It doesn't get snow there. That's the Front Range. They don't get snow that time of year. Typically, they get their snows in the spring. But while I was finishing this book, I went up the week before Halloween, and 2 back-to-back massive winter storms came through, literally trapping me in the condo. I could not leave. And it was like, well, okay, I mean, I was all safe and warm. I wasn't out in it. I did ask my son, he lived in Denver too while I was writing this, and a blizzard came through. And at one point I said, you know, if you really loved your mom, you might take a stroll out on the prairie without your coat and gloves and describe to me how it feels. But he didn't fall for that either. But you know, growing up in the Midwest, certainly tornadoes were always a part of my childhood. We knew exactly what to do in a tornado watch then, or a tornado warning. I grew up in Indianapolis. We didn't have too much snow except for the blizzard of '78 that everybody still talks about. But then I lived 25 years in Chicago. So then I got pretty well acquainted with snow and cold. So part of that was, you know, really helpful for me in the writing this. But when you grow up in the Midwest, and every region's different. I don't know how to write about earthquakes, and you're probably very well acquainted with earthquakes and forest fires, right? So every region has its own weather issues. But I do think the Great Plains, even today, still remain. It's still Tornado Alley. It's still this massive place of unpredictable weather that everyone grows up learning how to deal with.
Yeah. Well, and I think your point is well taken. I mean, I think obviously we are not limited in what we write about by having
what we come from. Yeah.
But I do think, for me at least, there are certain things where I worry that it's not that I couldn't imagine a blizzard, but perhaps I wouldn't be so likely to put myself in that particular person's shoes. So I don't know. I mean, I love South Dakota. I think it's very, very beautiful. It's austerity. And I've visited it a lot in the last maybe 3 or 4 years for different research purposes. But it couldn't be more different from, Los Angeles. That's
no. And I'm so excited because the South Dakota Humanities Association, I don't know, their humanities, they chose the Children's Blizzard for its one book, one South Dakota read. So now everybody, so all of South Dakota hopefully will be reading the Children's Blizzard. And I will hopefully will be able to be there in person in October for their literary festival. And meanwhile, I'll be doing a lot of events virtually. I hope there'll be a time that I can actually go there for this. We'll see. But I agree, the Badlands, that area, it's just absolutely beautiful.
That's fantastic.
Hello.
Hello, I came back. Liz, I didn't want to interrupt you. Did you have any other questions that you were like burning to ask? I just didn't want to interrupt you there.
Oh, I mean, we like, as Melanie said, we could go on all night. So no, go ahead and interrupt us.
Okay.
This is what we do.
Well, I know. And I want to tell everybody, you were talking about growing up in LA. Melanie, I don't know if you know this, but Elizabeth and I actually went to junior high school together. So.
We
I
did.
didn't know that.
Yes.
Oh, how
I
funny.
keep threatening to show her yearbook photo because I did find it, Julie. I found the yearbook that has our pictures in it.
Middle school. Oh,
Oh
middle
my
school.
God,
Those are tough
please.
years.
Well, and
don't.
I don't even know. I can't remember how we figured it out. But the second that I heard Julie's maiden name, I was like, I knew you.
I know.
You know, I have to say that I don't say this to every bookstore, and I love every single bookstore, but when Warwick's, you guys are my hands down. I have the best events with you.
Thank you.
And I remember I think it was from Mistress, like, I love my publicists. So that, you know, the publicists live in the East and they're not familiar with LA, right? So like oftentimes they'll schedule like, oh, you have an hour to get from Long Beach to Orange County. I'm like, no, that's not gonna work. But there was, for Mistress, I think my event there, I think my publicist had suggested maybe that Elizabeth could come down and do the event with me. And I'm like, it's not just, you know,
It's not just around the corner.
drive. I mean, that
On the map, it looks very close.
like that would, she'd have to spend the night. There's no way she could do that in one day. And so I didn't even ask you, but then later on I told you about that and you were so sweet. You're like, oh, I would have done that.
Yep.
Well, but you're absolutely right. That is not a hop, skip, and a jump in my view.
No. But I mean, Elizabeth, and you know this too. I mean, living in Southern California, we do drive, you know, back and forth. It's part of what we do here. So we do drive quite a bit.
Well, the funny thing about when I was at Warwick's last, I guess it was February of 2019, I had this tour that was all through the Midwest, you know, and I was flying in and out of all these blizzards. The only place I got stuck, San Diego.
San Diego.
I couldn't fly out. Too windy, and we had this. Remember that we had a massive rainstorm, so you know, you just never know. That was the one rain in the last 3 years.
And you were so worried about the cold when you came to Chicago, and you were like, "I've never been on tour in the winter before in the Midwest," because I always tour in the winter, and you were asking me about coats and scarves, and I was like, "Oh, God,
booties." That was what Melanie said. She said, "Make sure you have
booties are always good," but I was like, "You'll just be going from car to
right.
You're not going to be." Wandering
you're not going to be in a blizzard. You won't be out in the blizzard.
Like the biggest coat ever. Yeah, you took an enormous coat. I was like, why are you doing this? Now you have to lug it through all these airports.
But it is true though, I mean, Liz, I'm right there with you. And it's something I think that we don't know living there, because I do the same thing, like when we go to like Winter Institute or those kind of things, because we think that it's like, oh, it says it's going to be 20 degrees. You don't realize you're going from a heated room to a heated car to a heated.
Everything up, you know, because here usually we don't have the heat on, so we're not so warm in the house. It's funny.
Exactly. It's totally different. Okay, we have totally digressed here.
Again, we could go on forever.
I know. So there are a couple questions, and I want to remind everybody to ask your questions in the Q&A. I've got a couple of them coming in. And also, this is being recorded. So if anybody had to leave or whatever, it will be on our YouTube channel. So just want to let everybody know that too. So
if they left, they don't know that.
Yeah. What's that?
I said, if they've already left, they don't know.
They don't know that if they've left, but if they have to leave now, they might be. Okay, so Kathy wants to know, I guess since she's speaking of this book, what is the suggested age range for readers? So could youngers read this?
I think high school for sure, definitely could. Depending on how mature they were, maybe middle school, but I would feel more comfortable saying high school for sure. Yeah. And Judy's just, it's written for adults, but
yeah, but so you could do, like you say, I mean, and there's all different levels of readers. What I found in the book business, and it's just what they don't understand typically goes over their head anyways, you know, so.
Right. You know, there's a couple of, not much language because, you know, but there is one situation there's a little sexual tension, I guess you could call it, in one situation that one of the teachers is dealing with. But other than that, and it's kind of gruesome in some places, you know, because of what happened. But I think teenagers for sure. Yeah,
definitely. And then Judy's just giving her love to Warwick. She moved 18 months ago from Temecula to Jacksonville, Florida. So she's out, and so we've got her coming in from Jacksonville, Florida. So that's cool. Thanks, Judy, for doing that. I had a question. Was it always? And everybody, if you've got any other questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A for us. Was it always the Children's Blizzard? Was that always your title?
Oh, yeah. Well, so that is the actual name of the storm.
Right, yes.
Mostly it's known as the Children's Blizzard, sometimes known as the Schoolhouse Blizzard. So there was an excellent book that I read for research for a lot called The Children's Blizzard by David Laskin that came out in 2005. So it's 15, 16 years ago now that you had the same title. But I talked to the excellent publishing professionals at Random House, and we talked about it. And I said, if you're not, I like the title, The Children's Blizzard. I think it's a good title. It's the actual name of the storm. But if you have any problems, I'd be okay with it called the Schoolhouse Blizzard or the School Children's Blizzard. But we all kind of put our heads together and talked to people, and it was determined that the Children's Blizzard really would be fine. So that's how that happened.
It's good, it's good because that's the thing is that it just evokes you. It's right there. I mean, you know what you're getting.
I'm a big fan of titles that are not too poetic and lyrical, titles that tell you what the book is about in the title, like Finding Dorothy, like The Aviator's Wife, and this one as well. I'm a big fan of those kind of titles.
Yeah. And Elizabeth, one of the questions that you guys, when you were talking, I so agree with what you mean with Melanie, is that she just opens up these other ways of looking at things that, in Alice I Have Been was what it's just like, ooh, that was really good. You think and then it's like, no, you don't really know.
Well,
that's my favorite thing.
And that worked, that is certainly one way in which this book is similar to my previous books, because I did it with people's lives that, like Alice I Have Been, the real Alice in Wonderland, or perhaps The Aviator's Wife, where you thought you knew who Charles and Anne Lindbergh was, but in my novel you find out a whole lot more about the truth of their marriage. And even though it's fiction, I always say that novelists, we tell the emotional truth. And so in the Children's Blizzard, I'm doing the same thing. It's just about an event, and that the characters are imagined, but they are all certainly representative of actual people who lived in this time period.
Yeah, you do a great job with it. I love everything that you write, both of you. I'm going to start with Elizabeth on this one. So what next do we have coming from you, Elizabeth?
Oh, I have another book coming out in June. But I go back and forth from fiction to nonfiction. So my next book is called The Ride of Her Life. It is a true story about a 62-year-old woman who got diagnosed with cancer, given 2 to 4 years to live, got her farm foreclosed, and decided that she'd always wanted to see the Pacific Ocean once in her life, but she didn't have a car. So she got on her horse, took her dog, and started riding from Maine, heading for California.
Wow.
Where did you find that story?
Yeah.
This is my third horse story. So usually I find a reference when I'm researching another one, and that's what happened this time. So 1954 is when she set up.
Aren't I supposed to be able to read that? I still haven't gotten a copy.
I was going to say, if it's June, there should be
that's
some
right.
things.
The very first person. See, this is when you're friends. And you're also, we share the same
editor. Yeah. So if she's here, I still haven't gotten Elizabeth's book.
Well, I think it's not quite done yet, actually, but it should be soon, yes.
All right.
Fantastic. And people can find you. I know you have a website, elizabethletts.com, correct?
Yes.
And that's where people can find you, where to find like all your other, if you're in any other kind of social media, is all on there.
Yep. I'm also Elizabeth Letts on Facebook, also on Instagram, also on Twitter. So
fantastic. Easy. Well, it's always good seeing you. And Melanie, I hate asking this question to authors when they just release a book, but you're so prolific and you're always writing. Are you on your next one?
Well, I have been so prolific that I actually took a year off writing. 2020 was always intended to be the year Melanie doesn't write a book, because I have written a lot of books in a short amount of time. And I really needed, writing is an interesting thing. It's a business because you need to pay bills with your, you don't get contracts to pay bills. But on the other hand, you also are a creative person who it's not a factory. For most of us, we have to kind of, so I knew I needed to take a breather this year. Turned out to be the year of the pandemic, so not as quite as restful of a year as I'd hoped. I'd hoped to spend it traveling, didn't happen, but turned out I would not have written during a pandemic anyway. So, I'm just now, I do know what I want to write next. I really do. But I think I'm at that kind of place that Elizabeth and I talk a lot about, is that the right book for me next? I want it to be. It's what I want to write, but I think I want to write it. I know what I want to write. I think I need some signals as to whether it will be the right book for me to write. But I do know. And if it's not, I have a lot of other ideas that I'm ready to go on.
So then would we see a book in 2021 or probably not?
No,
2022?
so at this point, it would not be 2021. I would hope 2020. We're in 2021.
I mean, we are in 2021. Oh my
gosh. Okay. So no,
we both just
definitely not 2021.
No.
And most likely, no, not 2022, but fingers crossed 2023.
Excellent. Okay.
Which is, I think that's a good schedule for me. Like every other year, I think I can do my best with the books that I write.
Right. Well, and the thing too, and this is where, I mean, so many authors that had books released during this pandemic, I think like when the paperback of this comes out next year, hopefully you'll be able to like hit the road and, see everybody
and bookstores will be open to full capacity again, and people can go in and browse and talk to wonderful booksellers, and you guys get to do what you do so well.
And we get to do all that fun stuff. And then same for you. You have a website? Is that the best place for people to go?
MelanieBenjamin.com. And I'm on all the social media, as the kids say, as Melanie Benjamin author, or some version of that. You'll find me very easily. And all the links are on my website anyway. Also, I have a podcast. I always forget to plug this, that I do with my friend Edward Kelsey Moore, another Midwestern writer, also born in Indianapolis as I was. And we became really good friends in Chicago. And we started, he writes, The Supremes and Earls All You Can Eat was a New York Times bestseller for him. And we've been doing a podcast where we just kind of just talk about life and things. And then when the pandemic hit, we could no longer get together to do it because we used to do that in Chicago. We both started watching a lot of old movies to get us through the pandemic. And so now the podcast has evolved into, we watch an old movie, an old classic movie like Gentleman Prefers Blondes or something like that. And we just go off and talk about that and talk a lot about the history behind it and the funny things about the movie. And then we choose books that we think are similar to that movie. And then we recommend those books. And the podcast is called Who the Hell Are We? Because we still don't know. And it is available wherever you get your podcast. There is also a link to that on my website.
Well, Judy was I don't know if you saw that question from Judy, but she did say you have the podcast. So she knew you had the podcast.
Those who listen to it really, really like it because Ed and I we are just great buddies who we drink and we gossip and, it's just a lot of fun.
Those are the best ones though, honestly. I mean, the ones that really are the most intriguing to me are the ones where you just kind of are listening in on two people that are, are friends that are having a great time chatting.
That's basically what it is. And it's been such a godsend during the pandemic, and particularly now that I've moved from Chicago. Right. So, we used to get together at his house and my house, and we'd have dinner with our spouses, and then we would do this. And now we have to do it virtually, but it's been a wonderful way to stay connected. During the pandemic. So it's been really good for us. Yeah.
And that's the thing too. And even though the virtual events are it was sort of our thing when we pivoted to do these, we really wanted to make sure that we were, lifting up as many authors' voices as we could.
And
in a strange way, it is intimate in a strange way. It's definitely different.
When we get to do these with wonderful authors, which again isn't the normal when we're on tour back in the olden times when you would go to a bookstore and it was generally just you up there talking and meeting readers in person. And I certainly miss that. And, signing books in person, I miss all that. But we rarely got to do the event with another author because just logistically it was impossible. But now we can. And I find that a wonderful treat and
Me too.
A wonderful byproduct of what we're doing right now.
For sure. And as an observer, it really is.
And it's just so much, it's more interesting. It's more interesting when it's a discussion than if you just talking into a screen, just one person. So it is kind of for me, it was pretty fun. I was excited to be invited to come and talk to Mel.
You did wonderfully too, because you had said Elizabeth had never been You've been on my end before, but you haven't been the
Right.
person asking the questions
I
before.
haven't,
You
but
did a
I'm-
wonderful job.
Yes.
I'm a curious person, so I have no trouble thinking of things to ask.
Oh, brilliant job. Thank you. Bravo.
Yeah, really good. Because it is a little bit, it is a different skill set to do the questioning. It really
Yeah.
is.
Viv.
No, it was really good. It was really fun. It was sort of the same thing, kind of watching two friends talking about their book. So it was really good.
But all these conversations have been different because I have different relationships with the authors I've been talking to.
Right.
But Elizabeth's the one I'm the closest to. So
There you go. But that is a byproduct that is really, and you're right. During normal times, it's almost nearly impossible to get the connection because most author friends are on either their own tour or planning their own tour or writing
we're just all over the place.
Okay,
That's
Julie,
right.
next time when you invite Melanie for the paperback, I will drive down from LA, even though I think it's kind of far.
Oh, and we can stay
I'm
at that
looking
wonderful
at it.
hotel. What's that wonderful hotel right there?
The La Valencia.
The one that has
Yes,
the rain.
La
rain-
Valencia. We could stay there and have drinks in that beautiful
Yes.
outdoor
I'll bring your
restaurant.
yearbook.
Oh,
So that I can show, I'll have our 7th grade yearbook to share.
Oh,
that would be
Do
so
the job that-
fun. Oh, let's
I'm
do it,
just
let's do
so
it.
glad you didn't have it right now and are showing
I
everybody.
thought about it, and I thought, well, maybe not today. It's coming though. Just stand forewarned. You were adorable. You
Oh
were
my God, no! I think I remember. Oh. But who in junior high? Honest to God, who in
Well,
junior high? You know.
Yeah.
And Kathy just wants to say, not a question, but just wanted to say how wonderful this time was together. It has been great, and she's from Mission Viejo, so thank you, Kathy.
Oh,
Thank you.
All right, well, ladies, thank you. This was really fun.
So much fun.
So when I close out the webinar, it closes out for everybody. So this is our last time chatting with you guys. It doesn't take us in. Usually sometimes we go into a green room situation, but not this time. So anyways, this was really fun. Again, this will be recorded. So thank you. And let's hold up the book one more time. Children.
Oh, yay, thank you.
Blizzard. Yay.
Thank
we
you. And
love
thank
it.
you, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Yes.
thank you, Melanie. Bye, Julie.
Talk to
Bye.
you soon.
Fun.
Bye, you
Bye-bye.
guys.
Bye. Thank you,
Bye.
Julie.
Bye.